Operation Fast and Furious was the name of a case. It was a nickname of a case. It became a big political scandal. The actual name of the case was Jacob Chambers, and the Latin abbreviation for "and others" et al. And it was a case that targeted straw purchasers, which, like I said before, are people who buy guns with the intention of basically giving the gun to someone who shouldn't have the gun. So they're lying on the form when they fill it out. So what happened was, in Operation Fast and Furious, a newly formed group of agents that stood up in I believe it was September or October of 2009, Phoenix Group 7, started working this case. So I remember being at a meeting. My group, originally our group was the Mexico-bound firearms trafficking group. And like I said before, we seized thousands of guns, frankly. And we would refer the cases for prosecution. And 9 out of 10 times we told, take it to the county, or we'll indict it later. And later would never come.
Welcome back to Precinct 444, a podcast network by the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Icons, where listeners are introduced to incredible people working within law enforcement who have had a profound impact on the community. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. That was Peter J. Forcelli, author and retired law enforcement professional with more than 35 years of experience. He served with the NYPD and then ATF before retiring in 2021. Today, he sat down with Anna Muckenfuss, Director of Programs, to discuss his experience rising through the ranks, the transition from NYPD homicide detective to ATF federal special agent, the importance of holding our law enforcement institutions accountable, and much more.
Pete, we're happy to have you here.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And for taking time out of your busy schedule, too. We know you're up to a lot of really interesting things. So can't wait to get to that. But we're going to go through your law enforcement career. So sure. How did we get here to start out? So could you briefly introduce yourself to our audience who may not know what you've done?
Sure. Yeah, Pete Forcelli. I'm a retired ATF Deputy Assistant Director. Spent 20 plus years with ATF, not quite 21. And then prior to that, I spent just under 15 years with the New York City Police Department. Like most cops, started walking a beat. Back in those days, we actually walked beats. Eventually became a detective. And I spent my last 5 years there in the Bronx Homicide Task Force, which was just a tremendous place to work. But I got tired of the state system and switched over to the feds.
Absolutely. And that's more common than we think in law enforcement, too, which is kind of interesting, meeting people working here at the Law Enforcement Museum. So we meet a lot of people that start with local or state law enforcement and end up going into federal, especially here in D.C. So, but one really big question that we like to hit with everybody is, what made you want to pursue a career in law enforcement?
When I was a little kid, I grew up watching cop shows, 1 Adam 12. I know I'm dating myself, Starsky and Hutch. And I was lured into the false belief that police work was always exciting. And in those shows, as you know, they close all the homicides within an hour. So it was that. And then also when I was a young kid, I grew up in a neighborhood that was not a great neighborhood. We had a lot of crime. Across the street from me was a housing project, and on each side of where we lived was Section 8 housing, and there were a lot of great people that lived in the neighborhood. That's where all my friends were from. But there was crime. And I remember, I think I was like 8, 9 years old. There was a shooting that happened. It turned out, I found out later, it was a narcotics deal that went bad. And I remember the crime scene tape was up, and, it was interesting to see the cops on the other side of the crime tape. They were the only ones that could go back there. They were the ones that knew what was going on. And I was intrigued by how they were able to just deal with that situation. And that made an impact on me, where I just always wanted to go into the policing profession since I was a really, really young kid.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting to see those kinds of personal connections to we get a lot of people who they have family members who are law enforcement, or there's something that happens in their childhood that they see a law enforcement officer, and that's like, they're like, that seems like a really interesting thing to do, which I think is always really neat too.
Yeah, folks often think that I came from a family of law enforcement, but the reality is I come from a family of construction workers. I was the first person in my family to go into law enforcement.
And you began your law enforcement career with the NYPD. When did you join the department, and what was your experience like as a patrol officer?
Sure. I took the test to become a cop. I was 16 and a half years old. Back then,
wow.
They allowed you to do it. And I started back when there were 3 different police departments, which are now the NYPD. There was the housing police, the transit police, and the NYPD. Again, now they're all one big department. I started as a housing cop. And I went through the academy in January of 1987. Back in those days, housing cops mostly walked beats. So, I mean, I walked the foot post in the projects. Occasionally, I'd get to ride in a car responding to jobs. But it was incredibly rewarding because you spent time on foot, walking around, talking to people, getting to know people. And if you spent enough time, in certain projects, the people got to know your name. I mean, there were people who called me Officer Pete, and it wasn't like anything I took any offense to. I actually kind of liked it. So I knew whose kid belonged to which apartment, and who the parents were. And it was a really great opportunity to realize the importance of relationships and of building trust in law enforcement. And it's something that I think we need to bring back, frankly. I know it's in some cities because of whatever budget restraints or, just how many people they have, they don't do it anymore. But I mean, it was the most rewarding part of my career was walking a beat in uniform, sometimes on the midnight shift, sometimes on the 4 to 12 shift. Even though it doesn't sound like it would be the most exciting thing, it was very rewarding and very impactful.
And you really rose through the ranks through the NYPD in your nearly 15 years with the department. What other roles did you have in addition to that, or even after that beat cop role?
Sure. Shortly after walking a beat, I did get a seat in a patrol car. We call them sector cars. So, handle jobs that came over 911. I was tasked to become a field training officer at a relatively young part of my career, probably too young. I had like 2.5 years on.
Oh, wow.
So I was field training newer officers, and that was great. But again, I think I was a little too young to do that, like in hindsight. I don't know, but it worked out. And then I was placed in what was called the anti-crime units after a few years doing that, which was plain clothes, but still doing patrol. So I wasn't a detective, still answering 911 jobs, but in civilian clothes. And then 2 years into doing that, so this would be around 1994, I was asked to go into the detective bureau, still with the housing police. So I went in, worked on all different kinds of cases, murders, sex crimes. I mean, you name it. If it happened in the projects, we investigated it. And about maybe 9 months to a year into doing that, Giuliani became the mayor, and he merged the 3 police departments together. And I was a housing cop in the Bronx, so I stayed in Bronx County because each borough is a county. And I was initially assigned to the 47th Precinct Detective Squad, which had a very large West Indian population, mostly people from Jamaica, working cases there. Back in the year that I started there, they led the city in homicides. So when you talk about learning, I mean, you learn through repetitions.
Yeah.
Great place to learn how to work murder cases. A short time after that, I was transferred to the 45th Precinct Detective Squad, which was quieter. And a lot of the homicides there were actually mob-related.
Oh, wow.
But the beauty of working in a quieter precinct is you had more time to work on murders. What a lot of people don't know is as a detective in the NYPD, when you catch a homicide, ideally, you have 4 days of not catching anything else to work on that murder. And on that 5th day, you're catching other cases again. So there's kind of pressure to get it done quick, which I don't necessarily think is the best way to learn. But then there were also times like during the holidays, if I was the new guy, if people were on vacation, there was one day where I caught a homicide and then 4 hours later caught another homicide.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I used to call it assembly line investigating, and it's not optimal. In the 45th Precinct, we had more time because there wasn't as much crime. And I really liked it, but even there, it wasn't as much freedom in working investigations as I like. So, but after a year in the 45th Precinct, I was asked to go to the Bronx Homicide Task Force. And it was around the time that the city of New York finally started to acknowledge that they had a gang problem because they had one. They just didn't like to admit it.
Yeah.
And when I went into the homicide squad, I worked on homicides like everybody else, but we also worked on federal cases. And that was amazing. And once I got a taste of working in the federal system and working with ATF and DEA and FBI on some occasions, even did a case with the State Department, I was hooked. I was hooked on the federal court system, on how much more effective it is in going after violent criminals. Because, look, it's a very small percentage of a population that does the majority of the crime. And what I saw as a city cop in New York was people would get arrested. They'd go to Rikers Island. They wouldn't spend much time there. They'd come out better criminals because they'd meet other criminals from the neighborhood. They would build small networks. They would go out and work together on things. Where with the federal system, I saw that people would go to jail for a lot longer, but also not in a jail where they knew people. Like you can wind up in Lompoc, California, Allenwood, Pennsylvania, Mariana, Florida. So, I mean, when you break them out of that cycle, the impact is profound.
Yeah. And a good amount of your work in law enforcement in general has been kind of with this emphasis on organized crime and gang-related violence as well. What kind of skills did you need to have to really effectively police those types of crimes?
To be honest with you, it goes back to what we first started speaking about, was going into a place where you don't look like the people who you're policing and talking to them. Because to solve the bigger cases or to build a gang case, we relied on interviews. And we were interviewing many times really, really bad people. I mean, I've sat across the table from people who have admitted to me committing 6, 7, 8 murders. And you have to have a conversation with them. And if you sit there and you appear to be judging them or appear to be looking down on them, you can't build that trust. And like a lot of people think it's on TV where you do one interview and you walk away and then you just move about. But no, I mean, if it's a bigger case, you could be speaking to that defendant 20, 30, 40 times. So, you know, having that trust is imperative to success. You know, the other thing I wish we had then that I see now is all the technology. Like we didn't have the ability to use cell phone towers and, you know, Instagram warrants. It was all through building conversations. And look, the other thing that folks need to keep in mind is, we listened to people and we got information from them, but we never just took their information at face value. I mean, when they would tell us something, we'd have to run down that evidence, find, you know, people who could corroborate it or evidence. And to me, I was addicted to it. It was fun. It was like really putting the puzzle together. And I was hooked. Like working the federal cases where you had the time to do that, man, there was no turning back for me.
Yeah. And kind of going down those rabbit holes and you get one piece of information and it leads to something else is a very interesting part of kind of that casework and investigation work. And you did mention earlier that at the 47th precinct, I think you said, where you kind of got started with homicide, you just had so many cases that they would pile up and you'd get that assembly line investigating that you kind of mentioned. Do you think that ended up, even though it was stressful to have that many cases on top of each other, do you think it made you a better investigator in the long term? Yeah,
for a number of reasons. One is, like, you know, you see things, because not all homicides are the same. I mean, there are so many different ways that things happen. So seeing that variety is tremendously important. And then, you know, when you're managing that many cases, you learn how to manage a case. And case management is an important skill because, look, you can investigate till the cows come home, but if you don't manage that case well enough that it's going to survive a trial later, then you're wasting your time.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, it was baptism by fire in a lot of ways. And look, I was blessed to work with some detectives who were around when I was a young guy when I got into the detective bureau. I was 27. Some of the detectives I worked with were around in the Serpico days. And the amazing thing was that these old timers, they were just so happy to impart their knowledge on you. I mean, so I got to benefit from folks that had 30, 35 years of experience who were willing to teach me the job. And that's a gift that I tried to continue to pay back through my career, you know, because nowadays you don't see that. People, they do 20 years and they leave now. You don't see that sort of tenure anymore. And that's something I think that folks don't realize, that that hurts the law enforcement community when that knowledge runs out the door as fast as it can.
You were with the NYPD for quite a while, and it was very much just the beginning of your career. You started out fairly young and then moved into the ATF. But tell us a little bit about that transition from the NYPD to the ATF, because you even started in the New York field office. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I was working a lot of cases with the feds, like I said before, in this quasi-task force capacity, because I wasn't a sworn task force officer. But I worked with DEA's Red Rum Group a lot. Phenomenal investigators. I mean, probably the best investigative team in the city of New York was DEA Red Rum. Better than any homicide squad. I know I'm going to upset some people by saying that, but they were just, unbelievable. But I worked a lot with ATF. And while I was there, because of the volume of homicides, I spent most of my time at the office. I never saw my kids, but they should have called me Uncle Dad because I saw them so infrequently. When I was working with the ATF folks, we were working on this case called the sex money murder case, which was a racketeering case, involved a bunch of murders, over a dozen murders, over 51 defendants. And this is going to sound horrible when I say it, but I would watch the agents come in and Thanksgiving Day when I was working a parade or doing something, they were home with their families. And on the weekends, they were home unless something was going on. And I realized that there was a better quality of life as a federal agent. But then the other thing was I had some exposure to something doing these federal cases called the proffer, which is when you sit down with the defendant and their attorney and a prosecutor and you talk about everything that person knows about, stuff they've done, stuff they've witnessed. And then, like I was talking about before, you got to go run that stuff down. And I fell in love with doing that sort of work. And I work with some guys. There's one gentleman who worked actually for the U.S. Attorney's Office. He was a retired detective named John O'Malley. He taught me more than any one human being on this planet has ever taught me. But I got so hooked in doing those sorts of cases. And the ATF folks were like, hey, you should come join us. That eventually I said, okay, I can retire from the NYPD in 5 years. I was close to 20, I had 15 in. Or I can leave and do another 20 years. But I knew I wasn't going to retire at age 40. So I made the jump and I did start in the New York Field Division. And the weird thing is I was pretty much working the same kind of cases as an ATF agent as I was as a homicide detective. So for some folks, it's a big transition. For me, I had a different badge in my pocket, a different gun, because I gave my NYPD gun back. But I was mostly working with some of the same people. And I had an office at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Lower Manhattan, which I already had as a Bronx homicide detective. So but now I had another office at ATF. So, not much changed. And I was kind of doing the same work, just going after violent people who use guns to hurt other people.
And I guess before we get into your ATF career, you started with the ATF in 2001, leaving the NYPD a few months shy of when September 11th, when those terrorist attacks happened at the World Trade Center. But kind of before we talk about 9/11, how had the city of New York really changed between when you started with the NYPD and when you left that position in, I believe it was June of 2001?
Yeah, no, you're correct. Look, I started with the NYPD. It was around the time where a police officer named Edward Byrne was assassinated. He was assassinated guarding the home of a witness named Arjun, shot in the head while sitting in his patrol car. That was unheard of in those days. Now, I knew that there were assassinations of police back in the 70s, 60s, the BLA, SLA, and whatnot. But it was because crack had first started to hit the streets. And with the ability for people who were criminals involved in gangs to make a lot of money, there was a lot of defending of turf and of fighting for drug territories and whatnot. So New York City was a pretty violent place. When I started, the murder rate in New York City was around 2,600 murders a year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Bronx County had roughly 700-800. By the time I got into the homicide squad, that was down slightly to around 600 murders a year for Bronx. But again, it's just one county. It's kind of mind-blowing. But in 1995, they went with that broken windows theory policing, and it worked. I know there's a lot of stuff going on today with, defund and whatnot. But the reality, like I spoke of before, it's a very small percentage of the population that's out there doing a lot of bad things. When you can take those folks off the street for lesser crimes and put them in jail for those crimes, they're not out there to shoot somebody or to commit a murder. So that the murder rate from when I first got into the Bronx Homicide Squad was roughly 600 murders a year. As a result of broken windows policing and taking some cases federal, when I left, it was down to around 200 murders a year.
Oh, wow.
So that's 400 people in that 4.5-year span that got to live. So, you would think that they would continue down that path, but, because of certain politics and beliefs and whatnot, they've backed off. So broken windows policing is now looked down upon, when in reality, it really had a profound impact on New York City. Yeah,
absolutely. And then kind of a major event for not only the city of New York, but the world in general. I know in D.C. we had We also experienced a terrorist attack on that day. But you're a survivor of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. You were an ATF agent during that time. And what was your experience like on that day?
I actually was supposed to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office, to the office I spoke of that I had down there on September 11th. I was on my way down, and I was just north of the three bridges, which is the Brooklyn Bridge, Manhattan Bridge, and Williamsburg Bridge, when my phone rang, and it was my boss telling me that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And my thoughts were it was some small plane. And even though those were the two tallest buildings in New York City, there were skyscrapers between me and them, so I couldn't see the gravity of the situation. So anyway, I drove down there, got out of my car, still didn't realize the size of the aircraft that hit the building was. And I remember putting on my rain jacket, going south one block on foot, making a left, and seeing this gigantic plane engine sitting there on a corner of Church Street and Vesey Street. And that's when it dawned on me, like, wow, this is a commercial airliner. So I did what cops do, because there's no training for that.
Yeah.
You just help people move along, try to clear the area so rescue and recovery workers can get in. A short time later, I was up on the plaza because the towers didn't sit at ground level. They sat on a mezzanine that was like one level up. And I remember going towards the south tower when the second plane hit. So I was there. I felt the heat from above. Didn't burn me, but I felt the heat. I didn't hear the plane coming in, but I certainly heard the explosion. And I remember there was a young paramedic to my left, or an EMT, and she was tending to someone who was gravely injured already. And I had seen her before the blast. And I remember turning and looking back in her direction after the explosion and after I got my wits about me, and I saw her now laying, down, stomach down on the ground. Her face was looking towards me, but she had no sign of life in her eyes, and I watched the color leave her face.
Wow.
So it was pretty clear to me at that point that, there was nothing I could do for her.
Yeah.
And I remember at that point looking north, trying to retrace my steps, figuring how am I going to get out of here, seeing the paper hanging in the air and the carnage that was going on. And that's the first time I saw jumpers. And it's weird because as a cop in New York, where there's a lot of tall buildings, you would get called to jumpers. Not often, but probably maybe a dozen times in my career. And they'd always be either a crime scene because someone had jumped, or a situation where someone was sitting on a roof ledge or on a bridge hoping to get talked off. It was usually a cry for help, but I never saw a human being fall from such heights.
Yeah.
And I remember when I first saw the first person jumping, once the initial disbelief, wore off, which was a split second, I remember bracing myself like I was about to get punched in the face because I just didn't want to see it, and I didn't want to hear how they sounded when they would hit the ground. And it's a horrible sound. I mean, I could still hear it today. So I saw one person jump and hit the ground. I saw a second person jump shortly after and hit an overhang that firemen and paramedics were treating people underneath. And I realized, hey, this isn't a safe place to be. So I went back north, back down the concrete steps, and ran into one of my bosses who told me that I needed to go round up the ATF people because, when there's a fire drill, people are supposed to gather so you can count all the heads. No one showed up. So I was like, okay. And it's weird to pick me to do it because I was brand new relatively, and I didn't even know who all the ATF people were, to be candid. But I wanted to be helpful, and I wanted to be part of the solution, And so I went back down into ground zero area, but this time on Church Street. And I remember first running into a detective friend of mine who was on his knees crying because his wife was in one of the towers and unaccounted for. She survived. But I remember running into two agents, Sal and Jason. Sal was an old timer. Jason was about my age, a little younger. And I was looking across the street, and I see a bunch of NYPD emergency service cops walking south towards the development. Again, they're at ground level. And I look, and I notice of these emergency service cops, I know three of them. John Coughlin, who's a big Irishman, a pipe and drum guy. He was a sergeant in my first command when I walked the beat in the projects. Vinny Dans, who was a cop I went through the academy with, also a housing cop. I had tried out for the emergency service unit with both of those guys. I got weeded out for fear of heights. Those guys made it. And then there was another cop named Walter Weaver, who, when I was a detective in the 47th precinct, he was a younger cop, and he used to come up to the squad room. He loved watches, so we used to talk about watches. And I remember looking across the street at them, and I'm not even really paying attention to Jason and Sal at this point, and Vinny Dans grabs his jacket, and he flops the collar like, hey, what's up with the ATF raid jacket? Because I didn't leave with any fanfare. I left on a Friday and started with ATF on a Monday. So I'm watching them walk into the area near the South Tower, and Jason Zamoloff, one of the ATF agents, just grabbed my shoulder because I'm fixated. I wasn't paying attention to what was even happening around me. And he said one word. He said, run. And I looked up, and it looked like the South Tower was toppling on us like a domino. But if you ever see the footage, the top of it cants.
And then it falls in itself. And then it falls
down, right. But it looked like it was toppling towards the East River. So he said one word, run. And I did exactly what he told me. So I ran north, got hit between the shoulder blades with something and ducked under a fire truck for, it felt like a few minutes, probably was maybe not even 20 seconds. And then I got hit in the face with the dust cloud, which was very gritty and tough to breathe. So I remember saying to myself, again, I'm scratching my eyes and I'm blinking my eyes and saying, hey, man, you're going to suffocate under here, idiot. Because fire truck, it seemed like a good idea, but a fire truck's not going to sustain the weight of a building. So I rolled out from there, ran north, and eventually ducked into a building where I was able to wash out my eyes and then came out and tried to help recover people. But you either got away or you were buried in there. And then, help somebody get to the hospital, which was Beekman Downtown Hospital. It's not very far from Ground Zero. Walk back. And then the North Tower fell. I wasn't as close to the North Tower as I was the South Tower. Still tried to help. Same thing. Real feeling of helplessness when you want to help people, but people are either on their feet and okay, or you just can't find them. But I spent 2 nights on scene. Didn't get home till the 3rd morning. And then from there on, spent, several days a week digging at Ground Zero. And then, that was for about a month. And then spent many months out at the landfill in Staten Island, where we'd spend 1 or 2 days a week. But it was a rough time, And look, I not to lie, Vinny, I watched those guys go in there. They didn't survive. Vinny, John, and Walter were killed. I knew they were dead that day. I found out later that on the 3rd day that 4 of my other friends perished that day. So it was tough to comprehend. Hey, here I'm still here, and those guys were gone. So I contended for some time with some guilt for surviving, as crazy as that sounds, Yeah. No, I look, I lost 7 friends that day, 6 cops, 1 fireman who was a cop with me in housing that became a fireman. I've lost 3 times as many friends since then. And one of the people I field trained, actually, mentioned before I was a field training officer, was a young lady named Jennifer Meehan, who became an NYPD lieutenant. And she, within the last couple of years, passed away of 9/11 related brain cancer. So I have plenty of people who I knew who went in there and gave their all that day, and some lost their lives that day, and some some since then, and others I'm sure will continue to lose their lives. It's tough. People don't realize that there's a lot of people who are still suffering as a result of 9/11. I'm grateful to the museum and the memorial for remembering that day, because a lot of people say never forget, but when you look at some of the stuff happening in our country today, you wonder. I think a lot of people, especially a lot of people who have been elected into offices at all different levels, have forgotten. So thanks for what you do here.
Absolutely. And to kind of segue from 9/11, which had a very profound impact on your career, to how did that experience as a 9/11 survivor impact the rest of your career as well?
In a lot of ways. Look, I had lost friends in the line of duty before 9/11, but, when you see folks who came into work that day expecting to go home, they kiss their families goodbye, never to kiss them again. I always carried that with me, and not in necessarily always a bad way, because like I said before, I did have some survivor's guilt. But you realize that these folks and the folks who lost their lives before, and look, folks who didn't lose their lives, folks who come into work who I respected deeply, and still are out there doing the job, some of them, they gave 100%. They gave their all to the job because they truly believed in it. So that impacted me in that I found it insulting to not try to give less. Like I'm not going to lie, I sometimes would judge some of the lesser enthusiastic folks who came in and gave the bare minimum, because I was like, how dare you? When there's folks who have gone before you who have given so much, given all in some instances, how dare you not come here and take this seriously? So I always tried to do my best, keeping that in mind, and also keeping in mind all those old timers that took the time to teach me the job. Like I always felt this sense of debt and a sense of honor to be allowed to be in that profession. And I tried to conduct myself that way throughout my career.
9/11 changed it changed the way that a lot of officers' mindset was going into the job, especially knowing that they had fallen officers that they had worked with, and that they knew very personally, and very profound personal loss there. But it really changed the field of law enforcement as a whole too, and kind of the landscape of local and federal law enforcement. So what were some of the changes that you noticed in that immediate aftermath of 9/11, especially working on the federal side? Was there anything that felt like it really changed in your job from the beginning or from pre-9/11 to post-9/11?
Sure. Well, look, in working in the Bronx in pre-9/11 New York, there was not a lot of appreciation for law enforcement. I mean, homicide victims' family, if you solved a murder, they were grateful. They would express that gratitude. But rarely were you ever thanked or felt appreciated. In the days that followed 9/11, the sense of appreciation was mind-blowing. I mean, you felt like the community really, really appreciated you. I mean, I'd go into a bar. I worked in the Bronx, which was not a very wide area. If I went into a bar after work to have a drink, people assumed I was a cop. They would line up to want to buy you a drink and thank you, which I wasn't expecting. It felt nice. As far as the community of law enforcement, it was weird because, and this is probably a touchy subject for some folks, there were a lot of people in the NYPD, to include people very high up in the NYPD, that were upset with the FBI, feeling they should have done a better job surveilling Moussaoui and the others. So there was some animosity between local law enforcement and the feds. That was quickly fixed because, everybody realized once they got past that initial shock that, hey, man, we have to work together to prevent this from ever happening again. So what you saw is the Joint Terrorism Task Force grow exponentially. You saw other federal law enforcement organizations looking at terrorism, but also just working together more because they realized that failure to share information and intelligence can have a catastrophic effect. Now, surely in the world of fighting terror, but even in the world of gangs, I mean, to not share information, which was the thing. In the old days, it was people wanted to see who would be the first to stand at the podium. It was about agency credit, like organizational pride, I call it. It became more about the mission. That's kind of changed a little bit in the last few years, where that organizational pride has crept back in big time. And I just pray that we snap out of it and not have to have another 9/11 or another huge incident for us to say, hey, that's bad what we're doing here. Let's get back to sharing. It's funny because I actually spent some time up in Canada later in my career, and I was shocked. Like I will be the first to admit that when I went up there, I wasn't expecting to be floored by a lot of things. I was expecting to see good cops. They share and exchange intelligence on criminal investigations and on crime trends far, far better than what I've seen here in the United States.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And we'll get into one of our next questions. We'll talk about kind of what you did with the ATF and in Canada. But yeah, go ahead and continue.
Yeah, so I mean, that's what changed, but like for me, another thing that changed is, and it's one of the reasons I left New York, is I got driving past Ground Zero, which was where the U.S. Attorney's office is located, is very close to Ground Zero. It got rough for me because I was fighting with survivor's guilt. I didn't acknowledge it back then. I'll acknowledge it now. A little bit of PTSD.
Yeah.
And I realized it was time for me to leave New York, even though I loved the work. I had great friends at the U.S. Attorney's office there. So I put in for promotions, figuring I could run away from that stuff. So I put in to go to Jacksonville, Savannah, Dallas, or Phoenix. And I got selected for the Phoenix Field Division, which was a big change for me because now I was going from being an agent, working cases, which I loved, again, putting the puzzle together, to now being a leader. And I took it seriously because I worked for some really great leaders, both in my early days with ATF, but also in my NYPD career. And I worked for some really bad ones, too, and you learn just as much from the bad ones as the good ones. But I realized what a great, and when I say great, I don't mean like good. I mean like heavy, like a large responsibility being in a leadership position is. So I went into that just really wanting to do my best as a leader, leading a team of agents in Phoenix. So I showed up, never had been to Phoenix before that, and just wanted to go there and do a good job.
And what was some of the work that you did when you were in Phoenix at that first new field office for you?
Yeah. Well, most of the work I did in New York, like I said, was, going after low-level gun offenders and flipping them, and then through the proffers we spoke of, and building bigger cases. When I got to Phoenix, most of our work focused on stopping guns from going into Mexico, because that was a big thing. The cartels would have straw purchasers, which is people who buy guns for them. They're not supposed to do it. It's a crime. Buy guns that they would then traffic into Mexico. To be honest with you, I saw a lot in New York City. I saw a lot of murders. I saw a lot of crazy stuff because New York's a big city.
Yeah.
I was shocked with what I saw in Phoenix. Just the level of firearms trafficking that was going into Mexico primarily, but also into California, which has stricter laws than Arizona does, was mind-blowing. I mean, it was nonstop car stops and interdictions. Most of the tips that we got came from licensed gun dealers, like gun stores, would call us when they would see something suspicious. We would go out there. They would sell the gun while we were waiting outside. We would stop the car, ask questions. One of the things that shocked me, though, was like in New York, the prosecutors took anything we brought them. And then, look, they wanted a good case, so they would tell you, hey, we'll take it, but we want you to do A, B, and C. But we were never told no. In Phoenix, 9 out of 10 of the cases that we brought to the United States Attorney's Office, they turned away, which completely shocked me. And, you know, so, I mean, we had to formulate other ways to do things. We took some cases to the county. We built a relationship with the Arizona Attorney General's office out of necessity. I mean, they mostly worked on like fraud cases and white collar crime. And we were like, hey, man, we need your help. And they were like, all right, let's go. And they were great partners. But my entire time in Phoenix, we struggled with the United States Attorney's Office there to get them to take the problem seriously. And that's partly what led to something that I later blew the whistle on out there. Was just, you know, it was appalling what I saw, especially when you consider the deaths that were happening in Mexico with the smuggled guns. A lot of them, a lot of deaths.
Absolutely. And we'll get into what you kind of alluded to in just a little bit. But I do want to talk a little bit about your time in Eastern Canada first. When you were working, what was the position that you were with in Eastern Canada?
Sure. When I did leave Phoenix eventually, after that thing we'll talk about later, you know, first I went to ATF headquarters for a very short time, and they candidly didn't know what to do with me. And a position had opened up in Toronto, and it would be a liaison position.
Yes.
Where I would liaise with all law enforcement entities in Canada, from Manitoba to the Maritimes, they call it, which is like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. So I went up there. I had an office in the U.S. consulate space, and we had another office that was near Pearson Airport. And I worked with the Ontario Provincial Police and the Toronto Police and the Canadian Border Security Administration, mostly. But we also work with RCMP and some of the smaller departments up there. And our job was to help them trace the guns that were smuggled from the U.S. into Canada, and then refer cases back to the U.S. against the people who bought the guns that were smuggled up to Canada. Figure out, how did the gun get from, say, Alabama to a crime scene in Toronto? And so that was part of it. Another part was training. And then we also worked with them a little bit on some tobacco smuggling issues. But it was a great experience. Canadian cops are just a fun bunch of people, very, very professional, but they're very lighthearted. So it was actually some of the best times in my career, as far as just like being able to go to work and just feel like I was making a difference, but also just laugh and just feel like, I mean, there was really no pressure up there, you know, because they were grateful for us being there in the first place. So it wasn't like they were demanding much from us. So you just tried to be as good a partner as you could be. But what a great 2 years.
Absolutely. That sounded like a really interesting position. So I wanted to make sure that we touched on that. I also want to touch on your time with the Miami field office as a special agent in charge. So while you were serving as special agent in charge in Miami, you oversaw ATF's response to several mass shootings, including the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport shooting in January 2017 and the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida in February of 2018. And then additionally, you oversaw the ATF's investigation into Omar Mateen, who was the Pulse nightclub shooter. What role does the ATF play in investigating those types of mass shooter events?
Truthfully, our role is to be as good a partner as we can be to the local and state officials who are running those cases. You know, I mean, you see on the news, you see the FBI raid jackets and the ATF raid jackets. The reality is, I think the Fort Lauderdale airport one was a little bit different because shooting somebody in the airport is a federal crime. But those other crimes were state crimes. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to help the locals figure out, how did this person acquire the firearm? Did someone buy it for them? Were there other people involved in the plot? Do those people have guns? I mean, is there another threat out there that we don't know about? So what you're really doing is you're tracing the source of where the gun that was recovered came from, and then kind of working backwards to see what other guns did this person purchase in the past, because there's no database. It's not like people think, and it's not like on NCIS or CSI where you call an office and you have somebody run a query. With those, it's different. Like you literally have to call ATF with the serial number. You need all the information, the manufacturer's information, the importer's information, the serial number. And it's funny because some people don't know where to find those things.
Yeah.
Like, so I've had people try to trace a zip code on the manufacturer's address as a serial number. So, it's just to provide your expertise there. And then so what happens is you'll call ATF's Tracing Center, which is a big building in West Virginia. Those folks will take that information and then they'll call the manufacturer. Say, I'll think of one, Century Arms. Hey, this gun was brought, either made or imported on this date. Can you tell us where it was sent to? Well, it was sent to Pete's, wholesalers in Brunswick, Georgia. So then they will call. You got this gun on this date, according to what we know. Can you tell us, where you dispose of it? So they'll have to look through their records, searching through all kinds of papers. And they may say, well, we sent it to Anna's gun store in Phoenix. And then they'll call Anna. Did you acquire this gun? Can you tell us who you sold it to? And so the trace will go to the first retail sale, like when it left the doors of a store and went into the hands of a civilian. Doesn't mean that person committed a crime. Sometimes the guns are committed with the crimes are committed with stolen guns. There's a lot of factors. But that's our job, is to investigate how did that gun get from being made, its transit to the final place where it was first sold into the retail market, and then from there to try to figure out how did it get into the hands of the shooter. And then we provide that information to our state and local partner. So it's really chasing down the story of the gun. And then we'll help with anything else. Like with the Parkland case, we helped interview family members. We helped make notifications. Fort Lauderdale Airport was a little bit different because the FBI was involved, and that was initially the Broward County Sheriff's Office was handling it, but eventually it became an FBI case. And then with the Pulse nightclub shooting, it was the same thing. How did he get because there were 3 guns. 2 of them were guns he purchased. He didn't break any laws purchasing them, unfortunately. He had some issues. He was on a terror watch list, and the gun dealers weren't made aware of that. Not their fault, right? And one of his guns was actually provided to him by his employer because he was an armed security guard. Oh. Yeah. So, but we had to figure out how did he get that. And it was funny because the gun that he had from the security company was somewhat of a mystery because the serial number came back, it couldn't be traced. Well, the reason was it was such an old gun, it was a revolver, that it was put into the hands of the security company before of the Gun Control Act of 1968 was even enacted. Oh, wow. So what we did was we're like, all right, well, wait a minute. He's a security guard. Was he an arms? Let's go knock on the door. It amazed me that other people didn't think of it. It was like, let's go knock on the door of a security guard company and ask them if they gave him a gun. And lo and behold, they had assigned him a pistol, and that's the pistol that he had in his vehicle. So, but that's our role, is tracing the gun. And then providing whatever help we can provide. Like, what do you need from us? And if we can do it legally, we'll do it. Absolutely. Your role as an investigator was you were the supervisory special agent for those cases. Yes. Are there any moments from those cases that have really stuck with you? Well, the Pulse nightclub case, the interesting thing was I did not really spend much time in the crime scene because the crime scene itself was in the area of the Tampa Field Division. So I went up there just to see what they needed and then quickly went back to Miami. And the shooter, Mr. Mateen, was from the Fort Pierce area, which fell under my area. So we were more involved in the investigation of him than the case. With the others, we had everything, the crime scene and the shooter, like everything fell in our areas. And there's 2 things. With the Fort Lauderdale Airport shooting, there were a few things that bothered me, one of which was that the gun that was used in that case was taken from the shooter in Alaska by the FBI. And they questioned him and didn't feel that he was a threat, so they gave him the gun back. And then he boarded a flight. He checked it in. By law, you're supposed to check it in with TSA. He followed those rules, flew to Fort Lauderdale Airport, took his bag off the carousel, went into the bathroom, opened up his baggage, took it out of the lockbox, came out and shot 5 people. And what I remember that bothered me was the people were all somewhat elderly folks, and they were there to go on a cruise. So, you're looking at these people who are now covered in plastic blankets. Yeah. And, because we're human beings. And by this time, I hadn't seen a homicide in a while because I'm an executive. So that, you kind of build up this wall to defend yourself. And my wall was gone because I hadn't been to a scene like that in a while. And I remember just really being heartbroken because you're processing, wow, these people came here maybe for a vacation they saved up for years for, maybe a honeymoon, like you didn't know, and they were about to have the time of their life, and now their life is taken from them. So there was that at the Fort Lauderdale Airport. And then the other issue I had was I had an agent, very, very good guy, he had dropped his daughter off to go on a flight. So he was on one side of the security infrastructure for the airport, and his daughter was on the other side. So he didn't know if his daughter was injured. So he couldn't just get through. It's not like they just.
No.
So I mean, he was struggling with some stuff himself because he was worried about his daughter. So my job was to manage the scene, but also to manage my people, and that even included my guy who's now suffering because he doesn't know what to do. So I mean, that was tough. And then with Parkland, there was a lot of things that really factored into that one. One was I had just come back from having my right lung removed. I was out of work for a long time because of the 9/11 related cancer. So I remember like when I walked the scene, the crime scene was massive. By the time I had gotten to the crime scene, I was so winded that I was just really trying to focus on not passing out, frankly. But I remember the sheriff brought me in. We looked at the scene very quickly, and he had asked me, can you guys take this scene? Because there was some issues with the FBI at the Fort Lauderdale airport shooting, and he wanted us to take it. And I'm trying to process, like, we don't have a big enough team to process this crime scene. I don't have body bags handy. I'm thinking to myself, I know that area of Florida has a lot of people who are Jewish and Muslim, and there are certain rules as to how soon they want their folks buried. And I was like, there's no way we could do this without offending somebody, because I'd have to fly in assets from all over the country. So I said no. But I remember touring the crime scene, and you saw some of the kids clearly were trying to shield other kids.
Yeah.
And they died doing it. So here, like when you think of heroism, you think cops, firemen. These were teenagers, And then there was the coach outside who was outside of the doors, who initially tried to protect the kids inside. So, I mean, you just looked at that profound loss and the heroism of those young kids. But I was also at the same time coping with the fact that I didn't know myself if I was, if it had the cancer spread, none of that stuff was known yet. So here I'm looking at all of these poor young kids, and I know it sounds horrible, maybe selfish, but at the same time, I'm kind of coping with my own mortality. There was just a lot of things to process there. And it's interesting because my understanding is tomorrow they're actually knocking Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School down.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So here we're talking the day before they're knocking it down, which I think is probably good for the families to not have that thing there anymore. But what a horrible thing for everybody, for that community, for all the cops and firemen and agents that went and had to see what they saw, because you can't unsee those things.
Absolutely.
So it left the mark.
Yeah. And you were just part of one of our panels that we had back in April to talk about kind of the way that law enforcement officers and communities as a whole are impacted by these kinds of mass shooting events, especially looking at the 25th anniversary of Columbine that just passed last April. It's a very real thing to think about. It makes everyone think about their mortality, those types of events, and hearing that kind of firsthand account, kind of hearing you say that you're contemplating your own mortality as you're watching these, processing this scene of something that's absolutely unspeakable. Like it really brings all of that home and humanizes a very critical issue that is still very much present in our society as a whole. So
yeah. Well, the nice thing, and there is good that comes out of bad, is the military not that long ago finally started to deal with mental health for their military folks that came back with PTSD. Law enforcement, thank God, has started to follow suit. And I don't know if we've gone or have as much success as the military has had, but for the longest time, it was suck it up. There's this mindset of like, we're the police, we're the ones you come to for help. We never ask for help. That did a lot of damage to the law enforcement community. Police suicides are usually much higher than police homicides every year. So it's good, and look, it took me a while to actually acknowledge that I needed to talk to folks and get some help. So, anybody listening to this, who may be in that situation, I hope that they would pick up the phone or talk to a clergy member, a friend, somebody who's been through trauma themselves. It's such an important thing that we take care of ourselves, And
it's the field of law enforcement, even when you're not responding to mass shooter events and things like that, there are a lot of very heavy things that you're asked to respond to on a daily basis. And now that we've kind of covered all of these kind of bigger cases, but there's something kind of even bigger that you were a part of in relation to your work at the ATF. So you were a whistleblower for Operation Fast and Furious, which occurred at the ATF's Phoenix Field office between 2009 and 2011. Could you describe what Operation Fast and Furious was for our listeners who may not be familiar with it?
Sure. Operation Fast and Furious was the name of a case. It was a nickname of a case. It became a big political scandal. The actual name of the case was Jacob Chambers, and the Latin abbreviation for "and others" et al. And it was a case that targeted straw purchasers, which, like I said before, are people who buy guns with the intention of basically giving the gun to someone who shouldn't have the gun. So they're lying on the form when they fill it out. So what happened was, in Operation Fast and Furious, a newly formed group of agents that stood up in I believe it was September or October of 2009, Phoenix Group 7, started working this case. So I remember being at a meeting. My group, originally our group was the Mexico-bound firearms trafficking group. And like I said before, we seized thousands of guns, frankly. And we would refer the cases for prosecution. And 9 out of 10 times we told, take it to the county, or we'll indict it later. And later would never come. So, but we always stopped the guns because, we knew that this gun wasn't being sent to a hunter or some target shooter. These were guns being sent to criminals. And, even though we knew they were probably heading to Mexico, there's nothing said that it couldn't be used to shoot some Arizona trooper, DPS, or some person between Phoenix and the border. But we always seized the guns. So what happened was, in this new case, I was a supervisor in a different group, but we would be there at like a meeting every week where all the supervisors would be together. And the Phoenix Group 7 supervisor talks about this case where they identified 600 guns. So my thoughts were they found some treasure trove of records, and they figured out that there was some network and that they were going to go out there and start knocking on doors and talking to straw purchasers like we would have done in the past. But again, none of my business, not my group. So at a subsequent meeting, the number is going up, like roughly 900. So now I start asking other supervisors who were there, like, hey, are they stopping these cars? I mean, what are they doing? And we were told, hey, man, we're doing something different. So I'm not an arrogant person. I don't know everything about policing. So I'm like, okay, they must be doing something different. Never really tried to think about what that different was. Never assumed it was just letting the guns right off into the sunset. So then at a subsequent meeting, the numbers are going up and then up. And then finally, I start making some noise within the management of the Phoenix Field Division saying, hey, man, like, what are you folks doing? And I would constantly be told, hey, don't worry about it. We got this. This is groundbreaking. Still not thinking that the guns are being allowed to go to the cartels. Well, in December of 2010, a Border Patrol agent named Brian Terry, a hero, was patrolling the border. I believe it's called Peck Canyon, which is not far from a town called Rio Rico. It's near Nogales. And he was looking for drug bandits because the cartels, they're people who smuggle drugs into the U.S. Their rival cartels will rob each other. I mean, it's no honor among thieves, right? Well, Brian Terry gets shot in the back and killed. Now, we didn't know anything about this. Well, what happens is once the word gets out, an agent in that group, again, Phoenix Group 7, not my group, they were located at a different site. He blew the whistle. He contacted the office of Senator Chuck Grassley. And so what happens is at one of these meetings with my supervisor, the head of the Phoenix field office, he tells us, hey, the U.S. Attorney's Office is really pissed off at John Dodson. He's reached out to Senator Grassley's office. My advice is to steer clear of John, and don't be surprised if he doesn't find himself indicted. And I'm sitting there to myself, like, my mind is blown. I'm like, wait a minute, hold on. All of these cases that we recommended for prosecution that they said they would indict that they never indicted, or the cases that they flat out declined, right? And then there were other cases where we would recover the gun, like the gun would be recovered in Mexico. We would identify who bought it and try to prosecute them. And we were always told, well, the gun is in Mexico. We can't prosecute those. So now I'm thinking, wait a minute, here they're going to possibly indict this agent named John Dodson. And then you hear in the strategy of the case was to let the guns go to Mexico. We were always told once the gun was in Mexico, they couldn't prosecute it. So anyway, after that meeting, I went home and I was thinking about it, and it really bothered me because I'm like, thinking about all the cases and my agents trying to make those cases. And every time they would try to make the cases, they would run into the wall because they would be told, no, you can't do it. And I talked to my wife and said, listen, 'cause I didn't bring work home for me. I didn't think it was a good thing. And I said, look, told her the story. And I said, they're talking about possibly indicting this guy, John Dodson, who I didn't know. I didn't know John. And I said, I'm thinking of calling Senator Grassley's office and telling them that he's not lying, because they were saying he was lying. And my wife said, well, if you don't call him, you're not the guy I married. So the following morning, I pick up the phone, and I remember specifically, I called the guy. His name was Brian Downey, and he worked for Senator Grassi's office. I said, Brian, I know that you're being told by the Department of Justice and by ATF and by the Phoenix U.S. Attorney's Office that John Dotson's lying and that ATF never walks guns. I'm just letting you know that he's not lying, and they did walk guns, and if you subpoena me, I'll tell you everything you want to know. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, I got subpoenaed. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't not say something. Once here you had a dead Border Patrol agent, and we didn't know what was happening. But once John came forward, he was in that group. He knew full well what was happening. The thought of letting them indict him was not something that I could have just stayed quiet and watched.
Mm-hmm. And it took a lot of courage to be a whistleblower in that type of situation. And you ended up being one of the whistleblowers that testified on Capitol Hill about Operation Fast and Furious. So what was that experience like?
Well, before, it was weird because before they actually put you at a hearing, they depose you. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, probably I testified on June 15th of 2011. It was in April. They brought us into a hotel room. Not like a hotel room that you sleep in, but like a conference room that they have in a hotel. And I got debriefed by not the elected officials, but their staff. Mm-hmm. So it was members of Senator Grassley's staff, Senator Leahy's staff, because he was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And then on the Oversight Committee, it was Darrell Issa, who was the chairman. He's from Southern California. And then Elijah Cummings was the ranking member. He's locally here, from Baltimore area. So their attorneys interviewed me for about 6 to 8 hours. And I remember walking out of that deposition, going back to my car. I parked it at our office, which was like 6 blocks away. I was assured when I went in there, hey, Pete, what you say here is this is how government works. We need brave whistleblowers. We have your back. I didn't make it 6 blocks back to my car before my phone rang, and it was a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office saying, hey, Pete, because I blew the whistle on them more so, and my command, literally saying, hey, Pete, watch your back, buddy. Everything you said in that deposition room was related to the United States Attorney. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing that happens. A couple of days later, I get a call from another prosecutor who's like, hey, man, we should meet. I was like, okay. Because I had some friends there. And look, some of those prosecutors wanted to do the right thing, too. I mean, it's not like the entire office was down with this plan. So I went and met him at the Paradise Bakery, which was downstairs from our office. And I remember he slides an email across the table to me. And it was from the United States Attorney, Dennis Burke, to his entire staff. And it said, and I'm going to get as close as I can to quoting it verbatim, anyone running into Pete Forcelli, even if it's seeing him having coffee with his family on the weekend, will report it to me through your chain of command immediately. And I'm like, okay, here's the chief federal law enforcement officer for the state of Arizona now wants to know every time I'm seen. Yeah. So I was like, okay, I have a problem. So anyway, I testified on June 15th, but between that email and then I was surveilled. Mm-hmm. I had people follow me and my wife and family. Like we'd be sitting in a restaurant and people would literally like sit down at a table within eyeshot of and just stare at us. So it was a very unnerving feeling. But yeah, on June 15th, despite that, I still testified. It was weird because now you're speaking to congressional people who were elected. And some of them ask questions that are just strictly an attempt to get a good soundbite for a YouTube clip. And some of them asked meaningful questions. So, but it was weird because I testified at hundreds of trials before that. So I tried to draw upon that experience of being a witness on the witness stand. But it was different because you have people on the ground on their knees in front of you taking pictures, people with cameras in your face. And you're sitting there with a microphone in front of you and you push the button to talk and it has a countdown clock. And it starts from 5 minutes and works its way backwards. And you're like, all right, I got to answer these sometimes very complicated questions in 5 minutes. I mean, it was a very unusual experience.
Yeah.
Well, and look, the worst part for me was I took the oath. I raised my hand and promised to do to abide by the Constitution. So I'm not going to say I expected it or liked it, but I felt bad for my family because they didn't take an oath. You know? I mean, they didn't deserve that. So, I mean, that offended me a lot.
Did you have young children at the time, or?
My son was in 10th grade or 9th grade. My daughter just started her first year of college at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism on a full ride scholarship, which we had to. She didn't feel safe, so when I left Arizona, she had to walk away from that scholarship. So I mean, we lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. As a result of telling the truth, really, which is not how the government's supposed to work. But
but it would be. I understand why she wouldn't have felt safe at school on her own. That would be very scary as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now you work as a public speaker and focus a lot on leadership training, and your experience as a whistleblower and what you went through at the ATF has become kind of an inspiration for some of those seminars that you give. You've mentioned a lot. There were that seminar is a deep dive into Operation Fast and Furious and kind of the lessons that were learned from that incident. So what were some of those lessons, and how can other law enforcement agencies kind of learn from that experience?
Sure. Well, I think the lessons learned is, first off, we all take an oath to defend the Constitution, which is a piece of paper, right? So, okay, big deal, some folks think. But it's not. It is a big deal because that piece of paper is symbolic to the people of this country. So when you raise your hand and you say that you're going to defend the Constitution, you're telling the people who you work for, because you don't work for a president, you don't work for a cabinet secretary, you work for the taxpayers. You have a duty to try to do the right thing. And look, I wrote a book about the whole thing. I owned my mistakes because I didn't get everything perfect. In my entire career, if I did something wrong, I would always explain, hey, well, this is what I intended to do, and here's where we are, and this is what happened, because that's how you fix things. So I think with Fast and Furious, one of the things that bothered me is they weren't willing to acknowledge that they made mistakes, and you can't fix what you're not willing to talk about. So I think transparency is important. I talk about that. And when I talk about the mistakes I've made. The other thing that I think is an important lesson for the folks to know is most whistleblowers, when they blow the whistle, and I'm sure you've read the newspapers and you hear about it, they're destroyed. They're picked apart. Some of them are divorced, bankrupted. We took a beating financially, but I survived because there were two people in ATF who were higher ranking who approached me and said, listen, as long as you're telling the truth, I have your back. And, they couldn't really defend me because they were not in Phoenix to see what happened, but they absolutely had my back. And when I say that, I mean, they gave me the space to defend myself. So it was never like, because I know, for example, the Deputy Attorney General told one of these people they wanted me gone. And he's like, nope. I mean, so, I think it's important for leaders to realize that if you have someone under you who's doing the right thing, don't get into that whole groupthink thing or become a yes man and be willing to cut that person's head off if you know they're doing the right thing. And I'll name them. Tom Brandon and Tom Atterbury were men who said, Pete, as long as you're telling the truth, we have your back. And they never flinched. And like I said, they couldn't fight for me, but they gave me the space to fight for myself, which most bosses wouldn't have done. It wasn't politically expedient for them to be on my side. Yet they kept their words. And I think there's a huge leadership lesson in that, as much as anything else that I talk about.
You did mention your book. You co-authored a book with Keelan McGregor titled The Deadly Path, How Operation Fast and Furious and Bad Lawyers Armed Mexican Cartels. So tell us a little bit about your book and your experience writing it.
Sure. Well, a couple things happened. Again, ATF never really wanted to internally acknowledge that Fast and Furious happened. So over the years, I would have agents come up to me, some of them who were with ATF during Fast and Furious, some who got hired later, but would Google search the organization and find out, oh, hey, weren't you one of the whistleblowers? And so we even suggested, because I left ATF as the head of training, we suggested, why don't we put together something to talk about what happened there so it never happens again? And we were always told, no, we don't talk about Fast and Furious. It's funny because I even heard one agent got back to me when he heard the book was coming out, and he's like, hey, thanks for writing it. And I was like, why? He said, well, because every time we would ask what happened, it was like Voldemort. We were told we couldn't talk about it. And the first thing I had to do was look up what Voldemort is. I had no idea.
From Harry Potter.
Yeah. So, but that's how it was treated. So I was like, how do you prevent something from happening again if you don't say what happened? Because I think folks will be shocked to see how what happened in Phoenix really was just the abandonment of some very basic principles of policing. It wasn't as complicated as people think. And then the other thing is the Border Patrol agent, Brian Terry, who died. When I testified on June 15th of 2011, and the hearing is still on C-SPAN if anybody's interested. I know people don't really watch C-SPAN, but his mother was there, and some of his relatives, and they were amazing people. Like, you could tell they were like just your neighbor. They were just good people. And they weren't bitter about losing Brian Terry because they knew that he had a risky job. And I'm not saying they were, they understood the sacrifices, what I'll say. But they were so appalled by the fact that all they wanted was answers. Like, how did this happen? And they were treated so disrespectfully by our government that it offended me and still offends me to this day. So I wrote it to tell the agents what happened and to give some of the answers, because I don't pretend to have all the answers, but some of the answers to Brian Terry's family. And I've heard from them, and they were grateful for what they were able to read in the book and find out. But again, did it answer all their questions? No. But when I retired, I just felt it was my duty because they wouldn't let me talk about it when I was still with ATF.
Where can our listeners find a copy of your book if they want to read it?
Sure. It's on Amazon. It came out on March 5th, so it's been out for a little bit. It's hardcover. It's available in softcover. It's also available in Audible, which I know a lot of folks, especially around here, you're stuck in traffic. So it's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble's website, all the other major booksellers, Books A Million and whatnot. And then for signed copies, I have a website. It's www.peterjforcelli.com.
Absolutely.
And, be happy to sign a copy if someone wants a signed copy. But yeah, it was just to tell the story because people need to know what happened there.
Absolutely. And it's an important story that can, especially for the law enforcement officers out there, and especially the ones that see themselves in leadership later on in their career, it has some good takeaways and really good understanding of accountability for themselves as an officer as well. Like you've mentioned, you've taken accountability for mistakes that you've made throughout your career, and accountability in leadership is one of the greatest qualities of a good leader. I think a leader who can say that I could have done this better, I handled it this way, but I could have done it better in hindsight, is always learning from those kinds of scenarios is a very good quality to have. So
I used to like to say I never lose. I either win or I learn.
Exactly.
And people need to learn from their mistakes. I've learned plenty, probably more from my mistakes than from my successes.
Absolutely. And so we're coming to kind of a close of our interview, but I've got a couple concluding questions for you here.
Sure.
So looking back on your career in law enforcement and your experiences, is there anything that you wish you had done differently?
There are times where I wish I didn't leave the NYPD because as much as I loved working for ATF, after 9/11, I kind of felt like I abandoned the organization, especially when so many of them were lost on that day. But look, for the most part, I had a great career. I got to work with some really amazing people. Not sure that I would have went to Phoenix if I could do it all over again. But no, I mean, just little things. Look, the reality is what I do wish is I wish I would have prioritize work-life balance a lot better because I put so much of my effort into the job that I wasn't necessarily always the best husband or father. And, you can't, look, I can make up for that now. I can't make up for the lost time, but I can certainly pay more attention to my family now. So that would be, I guess, more so advice than regrets. But I wish I would have known then what I know now,
Absolutely. And then our final question, do you have any advice for anyone who may be considering becoming a law enforcement officer or even transitioning from a career in local law enforcement to federal law enforcement?
Do what works for you. Look, I think some people that leave local law enforcement for federal law enforcement struggle with the fact that federal law enforcement is a lot more paperwork intensive. When I was a local cop, if somebody said, hey, there's a murderer in there, you kicked in the door and you went and got him. You needed a warrant. But now as a federal agent, it was operational plans and send it up to headquarters and wait for them to critique it. So, but both are incredibly rewarding careers. But for the folks going into it, I would say, don't believe the hype. Don't believe the stuff that you're seeing on the news because the profession is made up of some truly amazing people. And yeah, there's a couple knuckleheads and eventually they get weeded out because nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop. But if you decide to go down that route, just remember, leave your ego at the door. It's a profession of service. And, like I said before, getting to know people, to walk a beat and talk to people who, I never thought I was better than them. I thought I was part of the community. So I think if you go into it keeping that in mind and realizing that it's not you versus the world, it's not you versus the community. And look, there's going to be times you got to sit down with some really bad people, the few, and you got to be able to talk to them and relate to them to be successful. So be humble, be ethical, and just do your best. Nobody's expecting perfection, but they expect you to do your best.
Well, that concludes our interview, Pete. Thank you so much for coming in today and sharing your story from a very wide-spanning career. There's a lot of really good information there and a lot of really good stories, and we really appreciate your insight and having you on the podcast today.
It was an honor to be here. Thank you for what you do.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Icons, featuring Peter Forcelli and host Anna Muckenfuss. We hope you found this conversation enlightening and will join us again for another edition of Icons. The Icons series is not just about contemporary figures in the law enforcement community, but about all those who have served their communities and the world, from now and in the past. Be sure to tune back in with us for future Icons episodes. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.